I've been playing with API Gateway to DynamoDB integrations in AWS, and I didn't even realize how much we can do with them. API Gateway's integration with DynamoDB can help us create a very powerful, scalable API server without actually managing any servers or any code. And this tutorial will guide you through the process, how you can create one yourself, showing you how to leverage the API Gateway's integration tools, but make sure to stay until the end to understand just how much we can stretch these integrations. And just for some context, AWS API Gateway is a tool that allows us to create, publish, monitor, and secure APIs at any scale. It's basically a front door for applications to a backend logic that would be hosting any of our services like Lambda or EC2 instance, or in this case, DynamoDB. And here are some key components to API Gateway. Now, API Gateway has resources, and these are basically the endpoints where we define the paths and stuff so that our API can respond to those paths. And we can use static resources here or dynamic like IDs, and each resource is a unique identifier for a specific piece of functionality within our API. Methods are pretty self-explanatory, but this is the HTTP method for our endpoint, and we attach these to the resource, and we can create these for each resource. We can have a get endpoint, a post endpoint, a delete endpoint, and whatnot. And then we have stages. We can actually define different stages for our API, for example, staging and prod. The way that API Gateway works is we can deploy changes to these different stages. This ensures that we can test our changes before it actually goes to production. But depending how you set up your API Gateway, you can do this through the staging functionality in API Gateway, or if you have a different API Gateway for your different environments, then obviously that's going to be different. And like I mentioned, we have deployments, so any change that we make, we can choose not to deploy or deploy it, and we choose to which stage we want to deploy it to. And last but not least, we have integration, which I've kind of already alluded to, but for all of our API endpoints, for each method we have defined, we need to set up an integration for where the event is going to end up to. So this is basically the target for our requests. And this could be a Lambda, an EC2 instance, or any other service in AWS. We can have this go to an SQS queue, to DynamoDB, to loads of different services, which is the power of API Gateway. Now let's go a little bit deeper and talk about each specific resource and the methods we define for those. The way that API Gateway works is for each request, the request will go through 4 different stages. When we receive the request, it's first going to go to method request, then integration request, and then it goes to our target, and then on the way back it's going to hit integration response and method response as well. And we can play with each of these stages. If our target is DynamoDB, in the integration request is where we can set the integration or the actual DynamoDB query where we want to retrieve or add or manipulate, how we want to manipulate our database. But basically, without this transformation, we can't really set all of these different services as a target. So if we have a request that comes in and it only passes a user ID, and we want to get the user from DynamoDB with that ID, this is where we can construct our DynamoDB query and then get the ID, and then the data will be returned in its native form. So I don't know if you've seen the DynamoDB object, but it's not very user friendly. So we would need to map that somehow to make sure that it's readable from our clients and actually makes sense. So this is where the integration response comes in. So here we can transform the data, change it, loop through any results or whatever we want to do, and then we can pass it along. And both of these are optional, but they're highly beneficial when it comes to setting up integrations with different AWS services. And they're both accomplished by using Velocity template language, which is a powerful tool that allows us to map incoming requests into DynamoDB queries, for example, or map the response to an object. Cool, now let's show you how we can set this up. So I have here an API. I'm gonna create a new resource, which is gonna be called users. And I'm gonna also create another one called ID. So this now is a dynamic resource where I can pass an ID, and then I'm gonna add a method for this. I'm gonna create a method here, which is gonna be a get. And here you can see the integration can be with a lot of different things. I'm gonna choose AWS service and then we'll look for DynamoDB. I'm gonna get to the integration request settings after. Cool. So now I have this resource set up. It set up integration with DynamoDB, and this is not deployed yet, so if I click the deploy button, it's gonna get deployed. But for now, let's go and set up the integration request. So here, you can add a mapping template. This is gonna be application JSON. Few bugs along the way, but my integration request was a bit wrong and my integration response was a bit wrong. So basically the integration request looks like this. So this is just a query for DynamoDB to get an item. We have the ID, we have expression attribute values, and key condition expression, basically say I want the ID with this ID and then I'm grabbing the input parameter ID from the input parameters. This is one of the tools in the Velocity template language that we can use to grab the details from the request, which is very useful. Like we can pass query string parameters as well. We can pass a body and get all of those details, transform them, use them for whatever you need to, and then in the integration response, I'm just mapping the response into an object. And this is, like I said, DynamoDB's response is a bit unreadable and not user-friendly. So we can see all the logs here. When we actually test in this API Gateway test tool, it gives us all the logs. So here we can see everything that is doing. And then we have, this is the endpoint request body after transformation. So this is after it's run the integration request. This is now transformed all of the input parameters or anything that you have. And then we can see here the response before transformation and the response after transformation. So this here, we can see it as item, then email, and then this is how DynamoDB knows it's a string, the ID is a string, blah, blah, blah. And then I'm mapping those to an object. And this is the final response. Great. So like I said, Velocity can be very cool. We can use a lot of different tools in integration request. I've used various different tools from the Velocity template language in order to manipulate this query or a scan from DynamoDB. But basically we can do if and else statements, we can do for each loops, we can use like two uppercase on the strings as well, which is pretty cool. And there's also some utility methods. There's a whole page and user guide from Apache, which is who created this Velocity template language, of all the different things we can use. But yeah, this has been very useful to me when I was stuck in trying to find something in this documentation to actually achieve what I wanted to achieve. But there's also a lot of limitations when it comes to the whole integration, how API Gateway works. One of the limitations is you can't really do too complex queries. Yes, you can use a lot of the VTL language and stuff to manipulate that query, but if it gets too complex, there's a certain point where we have to use a Lambda or something else in order to get data from DynamoDB. And for me, the Velocity language was not the best experience to use. It is a bit weird, it's a bit quirky, but yeah, it's not too bad, especially for simple requests. You don't really get enough error handling. You can't really error handle anything. It just goes to DynamoDB and gives you back a response. And if it's an error, it's just gonna say error. But you can't really handle any errors. For example, if DynamoDB is down, then it's just gonna return an error. That's it. We can't add any business logic in here. Like I said, there's only so much we can do with the Velocity language, and complex business logic. I mean, the amount of business logic you can add is very limited, almost none. I think you can basically just grab different data from the parameters or body and pass it along, but that's pretty much it. And there is a learning curve when it comes to the Velocity language. For me, like I said, it wasn't easy at the beginning, but that documentation was very useful, just trying to figure out ways to do stuff. When it comes to error handling, the API gateway doesn't actually have any logs as well. Like these logs are very useful when you test here in the console, but if I use Postman to test my APIs, then I won't get any logs for that. So you can't really understand what's going on and why there was an error unless you come in here and look at these logs, which are very useful because you can see at which point there was an error and try to fix it. And API Gateway has a limit of the size of the request and response payloads. I think this is a limit for any type of integration, but just keep that in mind when you use API Gateway. And the last limitation I'm going to mention is the limitation of the velocity language itself. For example, I was faced with a challenge not too long ago where the velocity language actually has a limit on the for each loops, how many loops you can go through. And by default, that was set to 1000 in API Gateway. So my integration was returning all the items from DynamoDB with some filtering, but it was more than 1000. So I was getting cut off at 1000. And when you call the for each loop in velocity, you can see if there's if the for each loop has a next element, and that way I was adding a comma at the end of the object, and it would add the comma, it would just exit the for each loop. So this was breaking the JSON and I was getting an error, I wasn't sure why. But there's ways around this particular one where you can split the data into different chunks and then go through each of the chunks, but this would add a bit more complexity and latency as well, because now you have to go through loops in a loop and get all the data. But yeah, I'm sure there's also other ones that I haven't hit, but there would be limitations of the language itself. Despite these limitations, the API gateway and the integrations with different services still provides a lot of value. And if you need like an easy CRUD operations API and your infrastructure is on AWS, this is very useful. I didn't even know it existed until like a year ago, and I've been playing around with it, trying to push the limits and see how much I can stretch it to. So far it's been great. I would really recommend, if you have very simple CRUD operations, give it a go. You can also add data to DynamoDB. Obviously, keep all the limitations in mind. But yeah, it's also been very fun to try something new and experiment with stuff. But yeah, that's been it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something new. If you have any feedback, put down a comment. If you wanted to cover something else, let me know down in the comments. Like the video so the algorithm knows to show it to somebody else. Subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you very much for watching. Enjoy the rest of the day. Happy coding. Bye.